In this lesson, we'll learn how to handle errors and exceptions that may occur while we work with the web data via the URLlib library. Here we have a test URL that returns a simple HTML document, and we use the context manager and URL open method to open that URL and print the return status. And we know that a certain status code represents a certain outcome. And if we'll run the code now, it is most likely we're going to see the status code being equal to 200, meaning that everything is okay. And therefore we can implement a primitive error handling by using this status code. For example, we can use an if statement to change the program's flow based on the status code received. So we can say something like if f is our resource pointer from the context manager. So if f.getCode is equal to 200, so if everything is okay, then we'll read whatever the resource sends to us. So in this case, it's going to be the HTML file. And of course, we'll add the decode UTF-8 statement. So let's run this code and see what it will come up with. First, we should see the status code, which is going to be 200. And because it is 200, we read the HTML document. But of course, the problem with this approach is that we don't handle any other status codes. So we don't handle any other scenarios when the status code is not equal to 200. So what we can do instead is we can remove this hard-coded value from the if statement, and instead we can use the HTTP status module from HTTP package to handle all codes returned by the resource. So we import the HTTP status module up the top, and now we can remove the 200, and instead we're going to use http status.ok. If we run the code, we'll get pretty much the same result. However, now our code is easier to read, plus we are not utilizing a bad practice of hard coding values in our code. Okay, so this was a so-called happy path. So when everything goes well. Now let's work at the scenario when we might get an error while trying to retrieve the data from the resource. So to illustrate the situation where we don't have a code to handle these possible errors, let me add another test URL. So this time I'll add a URL that returns the 404 status code, which corresponds to the resource not found. And now when we try to retrieve the data from this new URL, we'll get into a problem because we don't have a code to handle anything but the 200 code. Therefore, we get an HTTP error. We don't really want our program to crash or terminate when something goes wrong. So what we need to do really is to add a code that can handle this kind of a scenario. So up at the top, we'll import the HTTP error module that can handle various errors. So now we can write a code that will use this HTTP error module to handle any exceptions that may be thrown by our code. So we'll wrap our happy path in a try block. So this is a path that our program is taking when everything goes well. And now the except block that meant to catch an error. So we type except, then HTTP error as error. And after that, we can create our custom print statement that will specify the status code and also will tell the user that we encountered an error. So we can write an F string. So we can say something like error. Let's put it in the quotes. And the placeholder is going to be for the error code. And we also need to specify F in the beginning. That will make it use the error code properly. So now when we try to retrieve the data from this erroneous URL, we get the 404 error handled correctly. All right, let's look at another type of scenarios when the URL doesn't exist, or for example, it was written incorrectly. So rather than an HTTP error, we will be handling the URL error. So let's transform this URL into another erroneous URL that, say, doesn't exist. So not such server.org. And if we'll run the code now, you'll notice that we are getting this stack trace with an error that our code cannot handle just yet. So we'll have to implement that behavior as well. So all we need to do is we need to add another exception handler. So below the last except, we will add another except block. This time we are handling the URL error. And of course, don't forget to import the URL error as well. So we switch to our main method, and below the last except code, we write except URL error as error. And then we'll add another print statement. It's going to be f string as well, error. And in the placeholder, we specify the reason for that error. And it's important to note that if we are using single quotes for our f string, and if we have an apostrophe in some word, for example, in doesn't, we need to escape that apostrophe with a backslash so that Python interpreter will know that this is actually a grammatical character, not an end of an f string. And inside the placeholder, instead of the error code, as we did before, we now put error reason. And now when we run the code, we are getting a nice error message that URL doesn't exist.